12 years. 12 years of loyalty. And they handed me a cardboard box in under 12 minutes. I had nothing left to give until I saw someone who had even less. Every single morning, rain or shine, I showed up at his door, long before I ever knew who he really was. He never told me who that boy in the photo grew up to be. If he had, I might have run the other way. I knocked on that door every day for a year, but today, the man who fired me answered it instead.
If you have ever given something with your whole heart and gotten nothing back but silence, stay with me until the end of this video, because what happened to Daniel Reeves will remind you why kindness is never wasted, even when it feels like it is. And if stories like this move you, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we have so many more true-to-life stories waiting for you, and it truly helps this channel keep telling them. Daniel Reeves had exactly 11 minutes to clear out 12 years of his life. He stood in the hallway outside the glass-walled conference room at Voss Industries, holding a cardboard box that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old coffee, watching his own reflection stretch across the glass. Inside that box was a photo of his daughter Lily in her kindergarten cap, a chipped World's Best Dad mug, a small cactus that had somehow survived 3 office moves, and a stack of performance reviews that all said the same thing: exceeds expectations. None of it mattered now. The company was restructuring, they said. Redundancies, they said. A new efficiency model recommended by a consulting firm that had never once met him. Daniel had trained 4 new hires in the past 2 years. He had covered night shifts when his supervisor's mother was dying. He had skipped his own daughter's school play to finish a shipment that saved the company a 6-figure contract. None of that showed up anywhere on the termination form. It simply said, "Position eliminated." He did not see the man who signed that form. Richard Voss, the CEO, had not walked the production floor in over 3 years. To the 200 people who lost their jobs that quarter, Voss was a name on letterhead, a face in an annual report, a voice in a pre-recorded video about exciting new directions. Daniel didn't hate him. Not really. He simply stopped believing that hard work bought loyalty from people who never had to worry about rent. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after his daughter Lily had fallen asleep, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to multiply in the dark. He was 38 years old, a single father since Lily was 3, when her mother left for reasons that still didn't make sense to him some nights. He had built a small, steady life out of scraps, a rented 2-bedroom house on Maple Hollow Street, a 10-year-old sedan with a check engine light he'd learned to ignore, a daughter who thought he could fix anything because he always tried. He did not sleep much that night. He didn't know yet that in exactly 1 year, the man who fired him would be standing in a doorway he visited every single day. The weeks after the layoff blurred into a grinding routine of job applications that vanished into silence, of unemployment forms, of teaching himself to stretch a pound of ground beef into 4 dinners. He picked up whatever work he could find, hauling furniture for a moving company on weekends, patching drywall for a contractor named Pete, who paid in cash and complaints, delivering groceries in the evenings after Lily was in bed and a neighbor could sit with her. Pride did not pay rent, so he swallowed it daily, one job listing at a time. His landlord, a clipped, businesslike man named Mr. Alvarez, was not unkind, but he was not patient either. Twice that first month, Daniel found a yellow notice taped to his door, a polite but unmistakable reminder that rent was due, that grace periods existed but were not infinite. Daniel would fold the notices carefully and tuck them into a kitchen drawer, as if hiding the paper might somehow soften the reality it represented. He learned to dread the sound of the mail slot. He learned which grocery store marked down bread at exactly 7 in the evening, and which gas station let him pump $5 at a time without judgment. None of this he ever mentioned to Lily, who was 7, and believed, the way children do, that her father could fix anything, simply because he always had before. He intended to keep it that way for as long as he possibly could. There were nights, in those early weeks, When Daniel sat in his car outside a warehouse where he'd just finished a 12-hour shift unloading pallets, too tired to drive the last mile home, replaying the layoff meeting in his mind, like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. He thought about calling old colleagues to ask if anyone had heard of an opening, and stopped himself every time, ashamed of how it might sound. There were nights, he thought, more than once, about simply giving up on finding something in his own field and taking whatever permanent warehouse shift would have him, forgetting the years he had spent building real expertise in logistics and inventory systems that the market, apparently, no longer wanted from a man his age, with a gap now appearing on his resume. It was on one of those grocery delivery evenings, 3 weeks after he lost his job, that Daniel first really saw Walter Higgins. He had passed the old man's house 100 times before, a modest, slightly sagging structure, 2 doors down from his own, with a wooden porch and flower boxes that had gone half wild with weeds. But that evening, in the fading orange light, Daniel saw Walter struggling on his own front steps, one hand gripping a wobbly porch rail, the other clutching a 50-pound bag of soil he had no business trying to lift at his age. The old man's cane had slipped from under his arm and rolled into the grass, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing hard, looking like a man trying to decide whether to call for help or simply fall. Daniel didn't think. He dropped the grocery bags he was delivering onto his own porch, jogged across the yard, and caught the bag of soil before it slipped entirely from Walter's grip. "Let me get that, sir," he said, easing the bag down onto the steps. Up close, Walter Higgins looked even more fragile than he had from a distance. Thin white hair, combed carefully despite the wind, pale, papery skin, kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that had slid halfway down his nose. He wore a cardigan, the color of weak tea, buttoned crookedly, over a checked flannel shirt. "Didn't need help," Walter said, though his voice shook with the effort of the lie. "Just resting." "Sure," Daniel said, smiling despite himself. "Where do you want this?" That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with charity, not with anything grander than a man catching a bag of dirt before an old stranger could get hurt. Daniel finished planting Walter's rose bushes that evening, because it seemed wrong to leave a job half done, and by the time he walked back to his own porch, it was fully dark, and Lily had already fallen asleep on the couch waiting for him. He came back the next day, telling himself it was only to check the roses had survived. He found Walter sitting alone at his kitchen table, with a bowl of dry cereal, because his hands, too badly that morning, to safely pour milk without spilling it everywhere, and there was no one else to help. Daniel poured the milk. He noticed the refrigerator was nearly empty, except for a jar of mustard and a carton of eggs, 3 days past date. He noticed the pill organizer on the counter, half its little compartments still full from days Walter had apparently forgotten. He noticed, most of all, how the old man's eyes lit up simply because someone had sat down across from him and asked how he'd slept. Daniel told himself it was temporary, just until Walter's family sorted something out, just until a home health aide got scheduled, just until he found steady work again, and didn't have so much free time on his hands. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and somewhere in that unhurried accumulation of small mornings, checking on Walter stopped being an obligation and became simply what Daniel did, the way some people go for a run before work or brew coffee at exactly 6 a.m. every single day. Before the sun was fully up, Daniel walked the short path between his rented house and Walter's, carrying whatever the old man needed that day. A prescription picked up on his way home, from a moving job, a grocery bag, with the soft foods Walter could still chew comfortably, a battery for the smoke detector that had been chirping for a week because Walter couldn't safely climb a ladder anymore. He fixed the wobbly porch rail on a Saturday afternoon, while Lily sat on Walter's steps, showing the old man how to fold paper airplanes, and Walter laughed so hard at her crooked rock designs that he had to wipe his eyes with a handkerchief. He mowed the small square of lawn every other week, refusing the crumpled $20 bills Walter kept trying to press into his palm. He learned, slowly, the shape of Walter's loneliness, that his wife, Margaret, had passed 6 years earlier, that they had never had children of their own, though Walter would sometimes go quiet and correct himself mid-sentence, as though he'd almost said something he didn't mean to. Some mornings, when Walter felt strong enough, the two of them would sit on the porch long after the groceries had been put away, and Walter would ask about Lily's mother, gently, the way an old man asks questions he already senses are tender. Daniel didn't mind telling him. Her name was Renee, and she had left 3 years earlier, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of restlessness Daniel had never been able to name or fix, a need for a life that didn't choke. Rename's de Menstert die tender aansafer enlisted. Later lifter, she sent birthday cards for Lily, most years. Sometimes a little money, rarely a phone call. Daniel had stopped being angry about it a long time ago, mostly, though some nights the absence still sat in the house like a draft from a window that wouldn't, well, quite close. Walter listened to all of it without judgment, the way he listened to everything, and one morning he told Daniel something that stuck with him for months afterward. A man who stays is worth 10 who almost did. Don't ever let anybody make you feel smaller for staying, son. Daniel didn't correct him for calling him son. It felt, in that moment, like exactly the right word. There was a photograph Walter kept on the mantel that Daniel noticed early on and never quite forgot. It showed a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing stiffly beside a much younger Walter, in front of a modest brick house, both of them squinting into the sun. Walter would sometimes pick up that photograph in the evenings, turning it over in his hands like a worry stone, and Daniel would ask, gently, who the boy was. Walter's answer was always the same, delivered with a small, sad smile that closed the subject as firmly as a door. Someone I used to know better than I do now. Daniel never pushed. He had learned, in the year since he lost his job, that some silences deserved to be respected rather than filled. Money did not get easier. Daniel's unemployment ran out. He fell 2 months behind on rent before catching up with a brutal stretch of overnight moving. Jobs that left his back aching and his hands blistered. Lily needed new shoes for the school year, and he bought them a size too big on purpose so they'd last longer, folding tissue into the toes so she wouldn't trip. He learned to say, "We'll see," instead of "no," when she asked for things he couldn't afford, and he hated the sound of his own voice every time he said it. And yet, through all of it, he never once considered stopping his visits to Walter's house. If anything, those mornings became the steadiest thing in his life, the one part of each day that had nothing to do with rejection emails or overdue notices, the one place where he was simply needed, and simply enough. Walter, in turn, became something like family. He taught Lily how to whistle through a blade of grass. He told Daniel long, rambling stories about working 30 years at a hardware store downtown, about a war he'd served in as a young man, about the particular way morning light used to fall across Margaret's kitchen table. He never once, in all those months, mentioned that his son had grown up to run one of the largest manufacturing and logistics companies in the state, the very company that, a year earlier, had eliminated Daniel Reeves's position with a single line on a termination form. By the time the second season of visits rolled around, Daniel had scraped together enough small jobs and word-of-mouth referrals to start something of his own, with 2 other men he's already met at the unemployment office, both laid off from different companies in the same brutal quarter. They called it 3 Guys Home Repair, which was not clever but was accurate, and they split whatever came in: gutter repairs, drywall patching, small fencing jobs, 3 ways after materials. It was not steady. Some weeks brought 4 jobs, and some weeks brought none, and Daniel still lay awake some nights, doing the same anxious arithmetic he'd been doing for a year, but it was his, built from nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to show up early, and finish what he started, and there was a quiet dignity in that, which no termination letter could take from him. Walter, upon learning about the business, insisted on being its first official client, hiring the three of them to rebuild a sagging section of his back fence for a price so generous that Daniel argued with him for a full 10 minutes before finally accepting, if only because refusing seemed to wound the old man's pride more than accepting ever could. That truth arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in early autumn, a year almost to the week since Daniel had lost his job. He'd had a good morning, for once. A small handyman business he'd full started, with 2 other laid-off friends, had landed its first real contract, repairing storm damage on a row of townhouses across town. He stopped by the grocery store on his way home, picked up Walter's favorite soft pears and a fresh carton of milk, and walked the familiar path to the old man's porch with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He climbed the steps, balanced the grocery bag against his hip, and raised his free hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles touched the wood. Standing in the doorway was not Walter Higgins. It was a tall man in a tailored charcoal gray suit, dark hair graying neatly at the temples. A face Daniel recognized instantly from company newsletters, and a single unbearable all-hands video announcing necessary restructuring. Richard Voss, the CEO of Voss Industries, the man whose signature, however impersonally applied, had ended Daniel's career there. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Richard's expression shifted through something like recognition, then confusion, then a kind of wary alarm, as though he'd start hell. Opened his own front door to find a stranger holding groceries meant for someone else's. "Father, can I help you?" he finally asked, in the clipped, careful voice of a man used to controlling every room he entered. "I'm looking for Walter," Daniel said, and something in his own voice, steady despite the shock, surprised him. "I bring him groceries most mornings. Is he all right?" Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father is resting," he said. "He had a bad night. I flew in yesterday when the home health aide called me." He studied Daniel for a moment, taking in the grocery bag, the work-worn hands, the flannel shirt frayed at the cuffs, and something behind his eyes seemed to be recalculating an entire picture. "You're the one he talks about, Daniel?" It was not a question, and hearing his own name in that voice, the voice of the man who had signed away his job, sent a strange cold current through Daniel's chest. "You know who I am." "I do now," Richard said quietly, and opened the door wider. "Please, come in. He'll want to see you." Daniel almost turned around. Every instinct built over the past year told him to set the groceries on the step and walk away, to let this be someone else's complicated family reunion. But Walter's voice drifted faintly from the back bedroom, thin and hoarse, calling Daniel's name the way he always did each morning, and that settled it. Daniel stepped inside. For a moment, standing frozen on that porch with a grocery bag digging into his hip, Daniel felt every emotion of the past year rise at once. The humiliation of that cardboard box, the months of silence from job applications, the quiet pride he'd soon built stone by stone in a life that had nothing to do with Voss Industries anymore. Part of him wanted to turn and walk straight back down the steps, groceries and all, and pretend he had knocked on the wrong door. But another part of him, the part that had shown up every single morning for a year without needing a reason beyond decency, refused to let a stranger's last name change what he owed to Walter. Whatever complicated history stood in that doorway, Walter was still the man waiting inside, and Daniel had never once let him down. He wasn't about to start now. What followed was the strangest, most unraveling hour of Daniel's life. Walter was propped up in bed, pale but alert, his eyes brightening the moment he saw Daniel in the doorway. "There he is," Walter rasped, reaching out a trembling hand. "My good neighbor." Richard hovered near the door, watching the exchange with an expression Daniel couldn't whelm. Something caught between shame and wonder. When Walter drifted back to sleep a few minutes later, exhausted from the effort of sitting up, Richard led Daniel back to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, neither of them really wanted, and finally spoke the truth that had clearly been sitting behind his ribs since the moment he opened the door. "My father and I haven't spoken much in almost 8 years, Richard said, staring into his cup rather than at Daniel. "Ever since my mother passed, I told myself I was too busy running the company to visit more than a few times a year. I sent money. I hired an aide. I told myself that was enough." He exhaled slowly. "The aide called me yesterday, scared, saying he'd had a fall trying to lift something too heavy on his own. I got on the first flight, and when I asked her how, in God's name, this could have happened when I paid for care 3 times a week, she told me it hadn't heartwarming, because someone else had been showing up every single day. Groceries, medication, yard work, company. She said his name was Daniel. Richard finally looked up. "I didn't expect that man to be the one whose job I eliminated a year ago." Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired, complicated ache. "I didn't know he was your father," he said. "He never told me. I don't think he wanted me to know." "He didn't want me to know either," Richard admitted. "I think he was afraid of what I'd think. That I'd assume you were after something. Money. Influence. I'm ashamed to say that's exactly what I assumed. For about 4 seconds, before I saw the way he looked at you." He shook his head slowly. "A year ago, I signed off on a restructuring plan, built entirely on a spreadsheet. I never saw the names attached to those numbers. I told myself the consultants knew what they were doing, that trimming redundancies would keep the company strong for everyone else. I have spent the last 8 years running a company from 30 floors above the people who actually make it run, and the past 24 hours, finding out that one of those people spent a year quietly taking care of my father, while I called it not having time." Daniel didn't offer forgiveness right away, because it wouldn't have been honest. He told Richard, plainly, what that termination form had cost him. The months of silence from job applications, the rent he'd fallen behind on, the shoes he'd bought a size too big so his daughter wouldn't outgrow them too fast. He did not do it to punish Richard. He did it because for the first time in a year, someone with the power to actually understand was finally listening. Richard did not interrupt, did not defend himself, did not offer some polished corporate apology. He simply listened, his knuckles whitening slightly around his coffee cup, until Daniel finished. Richard set his cup down and rubbed a hand across his face, looking, for the first time since Daniel had met him, less like a CEO and more like a tired man twice his age. "You know what the hardest part of this is?" he said quietly. "It's not that I owe you an apology, though I clearly do. It's that I have to ask myself how many other Daniels there are out there. People I never met, whose names became line items on a spreadsheet, who are out there right now taking care of somebody's father, or somebody's mother, or somebody's kid, while the company that let them go keeps calling itself efficient." He shook his head. "I built my whole career on the idea that hard decisions made from a distance were somehow more honest than emotional ones made up close. I'm starting to think I had that exactly backwards." Daniel didn't have a tidy response to that, and he didn't pretend to. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," he said. "It did. It still does, some days. But I didn't take care of your father to prove a point to you, or to get my job back, or because I somehow knew this would happen. I did it because he needed help getting a bag of soil up his steps, and because Lily needed to see her dad be the kind of man who stops for that. Whatever happens next between us, that part isn't up for negotiation. That's just who I am." Something in Richard's expression shifted at that, a kind of quiet recognition, as though he were seeing not just an employee he'd wronged, but a person whose character had been tested in exactly the way his own hadn't, and had come out stronger for it. "I can't undo the year you lost," he finally said. "I know an apology from someone like me probably sounds cheap right now, but I'd like the chance to make it mean something, if you'll let me." Over the following weeks, Walter's health stabilized, though he remained frail, and Daniel kept coming every morning exactly as he always had. Not because anyone asked him to, but because that had simply become who he was. Richard, to his own visible surprise, started coming too, more often than he had in years, Sitting with his father on the porch in the evenings, listening to the same rambling stories Daniel had heard 100 times, finally hearing them the way a son should. Slowly, awkwardly, the two men who had been connected without knowing it for a year began to build something neither of them expected. Not quite friendship at first, but a mutual respect, forged in a kitchen over lukewarm coffee. Richard offered Daniel his old position back within the month, restored with back pay that made Daniel's hands shake when he read the number on the offer letter. But he offered something more than that, too. A seat on a newly formed internal committee, meant to review how restructuring decisions actually affected the people behind the spreadsheets, a role Richard admitted he should have created years earlier. Daniel took both, not because the money didn't matter. It mattered enormously. It meant new farm shoes that fit, and a landlord who no longer sent notices. But because for the first time in a long goal, work felt like it might mean something beyond a paycheck. Walter lived to see Lily's 8th birthday that spring, sitting in a lawn chair in Daniel's backyard, with a slice of cake balanced on his knee, watching her chase bubbles across the grass, with a joy that seemed to erase decades from his face. Richard was there too, in jeans instead of a suit for the first time Daniel had ever seen, laughing at something his father said, looking less like a CEO and more like a son who had finally come home. He brought a present for Lily that day, a small telescope, and spent nearly an hour sitting cross-legged on the lawn, helping her aim it at nothing in particular, since it was still afternoon, promising her they'd try again properly once it got dark. Daniel watched the two of them from the porch steps, and Walter, beside him, reached over and patted his knee without a word, and somehow that single gesture said everything neither of them had ever needed to put into sentences. The internal committee Richard created that year did not fix everything at Voss Industries overnight. No single committee ever does. But it changed the way decisions got made. Layoff plans now required a written accounting of the actual people behind each number, not just the projected savings. Severance packages grew more generous, and notice periods grew longer. And somewhere in a policy manual that used to read like a legal shield, there now existed a section that Daniel himself had helped draft, one that simply asked every manager to consider, before finalizing any cut, whether they had ever sat down and had a real conversation with the person whose name was on the page. It was a small thing, in the scale of a company that large, but Daniel had learned, over the past year, that small things done consistently were the only kind that ever really mattered. Looking back, Daniel would sometimes tell people that he never once helped Walter Higgins, expecting anything in return. Not friendship, not a job, not the extraordinary coincidence of a door opening to reveal the very man who had once let him go. He helped because an old man had needed a hand carrying a bag of soil up his front steps, and because that was simply the kind of man Daniel had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of losing his job, he still wanted to be. What he learned, in the end, was that kindness given without conditions has a strange way of finding its way back to you. Not always in the form you expect, and not always on your timeline, but back all the same. Some doors take a year to open, some open in ways you never could have imagined, and sometimes, the person on the other side turns out to be exactly the one who needed to see who you really were, all along.